the way I would want to take our conversation is, okay, let's say there's a funding, there is a, like we don't worry about resources, and we do want to, undertake this exciting and challenging path of bringing philosophers and scientists together and supplement objective science with that subjective reality. So what ideas, what experiments, how that collaboration on practical level could be, so we can like understand like how it might be in reality.
Just on your first point, I think you're totally right that consciousness, what it's like to be a human being, is incredibly complicated and nuanced and changing. If you want to understand consciousness itself, I wouldn't ask a scientist or a philosopher, ask a novelist or, meditate perhaps. This is the way to get at what consciousness is. But in terms of the scientific and the philosophical task of, as you say, measuring consciousness, explaining how it fits into our theory of reality, let me say two things. One I'm more confident about, and one that's more speculative. In terms of the one I'm more confident about, I really think because of the nature of this inherently subjective phenomenon, we need scientists and philosophers working together, and it's doing what they do in their own rights, but connecting closely with each other and seeing how what they do impacts each other. So let me give you a concrete example that's not really to do with these big questions of where consciousness comes from, just in terms of the experimental data of where consciousness is in the brain. There is still zero consensus. Famously, 25 years ago, the neuroscientist Christoph Koch bet the philosopher David Chalmers that it would all be wrapped up by now. And a couple of years ago, he publicly conceded defeat because there are different models and there is no consensus. Now, I think, and this is emerging in the journals, what we're seeing is at least part of the reason we're not making progress is that one's philosophical assumptions about consciousness impact how you interpret the experimental data. So let me give you a real concrete example of that. Here's a question. Could you have an experience you're not aware of? I don't know what you think. Do you think you can have at a cognitive level you're not aware of?
Maybe not on the level of cognition that I'm attending it, but my body can register, my subconsciousness can register some things, right? There are so many processes in my body happening that I'm not aware of, but they're happening because like I'm a system, right? And that system seems working.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, but different scientists and philosophers go different ways on things like, the experience of the clothes on your body when you're not thinking about it, or, driving on autopilot. You don't crash the car, but your mind's on something else. Were you experiencing the road? Or another example, cases of change blindness, where we know, you only actually sort of take in a few objects in your visual field. And then, so there's two ways you can go with this. Philosophers, very scientifically involved philosophers like Ned Block, say, well, this just means our experience is much richer than what we have cognitive access to. So our visual field is incredibly rich, but we don't have access to all that richness at a cognitive level. He calls this the overflow thesis. Whereas other philosophers, Matthias Michel, example, who's very, very scientifically involved philosopher, say, no, this, you can't have experience you're not aware of. So it must mean our experience is much thinner than we expect. Our visual field isn't very rich in the way we think. Some people say, actually, we're only actually experience a few things at a time. And now, what does this have to do with the science? This really impacts whether you think consciousness is in the front or the back of the brain. Huge debate on this. I'm slightly oversimplifying the debate, because if you think consciousness is inherently wrapped up with what you're cognitively aware of, then the prefrontal cortex is going to be always involved. This connects with higher order thought theories of consciousness, where you always have to have a sort of cognitive awareness. If you go with Ned Block and think, no, there can be much of our experience is not cognitively accessible to us, then it can be just in the sensory regions, more at the back of the brain. So how we are interpreting the data depends on our assumptions. What do we do? I think what we need to do is temporarily fragment the field into teams of scientists working under certain philosophical assumptions, designing the experiments on that basis, interpreting the results on that basis. For example, with that
Can you
split I've
give me
just given.
one philosophical assumption that scientists might work on?
Exactly what I've just said, that one team of scientists will be working with the assumption that you can't have an experience that is not cognitively accessible, and this connects with higher order thought theories of consciousness. Another team will be working with the Ned Block overflow view, that you can have lots of experience you're not cognitively aware of. Just do the experiments. Just forget the other team for a time. Do your experiments. See which bears fruit. I think we need to do that for a time and see where it ends up. So that's one possibility. Here's something much more speculative that's I don't think anyone is doing that I'm tempted by, to explore whether there are new causal dynamics that emerge with consciousness that are not reducible to known chemistry and physics. I'm not talking about anything magical and supernatural. I'm just talking about it's possible. Philosophers call this strong emergence, that there are just brand new causal dynamics that emerge. I recently examined a very good PhD thesis by someone called Jonathan Emery. I examined it with Alyssa Ney, a very prestigious philosopher of physics, about gaps there could be for irreducible causal dynamics connected with consciousness. I mean, and this thesis partly arose actually. I've had debates with this with the theoretical physicist Sean Carroll, who's very much got that reductionist picture. No, there's just physics running the show. Everything else is just ways of talking about stuff. And so Sean's kind of, in a volume I edited called Is Consciousness Everywhere? Sean argued for this. There's no room in physics. There's no room in physics for new causal dynamics in the mind. But Jonathan Emery, in his PhD, looking into cutting edge neuroscience, cutting edge physics, identified certain possibilities. I'm not a scientist. I would love some neuroscientists to check that out. Now, imagine, right? We've got these warring theories of consciousness: global workspace theory, integrated information theory, higher order thought theory. Imagine if we found one of them had brand new causal dynamics that we could identify. I
Can
think
you
that would be a
elaborate
strong
for me
marker.
what is causal dynamics? Like, what exactly do you mean?
So Sean Carroll thinks really it's just the fundamental equations of physics that are running the show. You know, the Schrödinger equations, the quantum mechanics. Of course, we don't have complete physics because we haven't brought together general relativity and quantum mechanics. But actually, the problems there only emerge in very high energy or very high gravity fields. For most purposes with terrestrial goings on, we do know the physics. So this is sometimes called the core theory. Sean Carroll calls it the core theory. And he thinks that's really the complete story. So if you were a super intelligent being, you could just do the physics and then work out what's going on. But not everyone agrees with that. The neuroscientist Kevin Mitchell, for example, he's not on my side with the panpsychism and my philosophy, but he's inclined to think, actually, no, there will be things that happen at the biological level, at the level of consciousness, that you wouldn't predict from the physics. Now, it's very hard to tell because these systems are so complicated. How the hell do we tell whether what is happening in a very complex living system is exactly what you'd expect from the Schrödinger equation of fundamental physics? Very, very difficult to test. But I don't know, I have faith in human beings. If we could test whether there are some living systems which depart slightly from what you'd expect from underlying physics and chemistry, and if some of them were associated with current models of consciousness, I think that would be very strong evidence that we've tracked the markers of consciousness.
Do you have ideas how to test it? I don't want to push you if you don't have those ideas, but do you have some thoughts on how to potentially could be tested?
No, I guess I'm a philosopher rather than a scientist. I suppose I think the job of philosophers is in part to point to, in more generic schematic terms, areas of inquiry that have not been focused on. I mean, such as Galileo did in setting up physical science, such as Alan Turing did in setting up our modern understanding of a computer, of an algorithm. So I think this is what philosophers do, set out very schematic. And I think this is an area that has not been focused on. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Someone like Kevin Mitchell, for example, is defending this view that there are new causal dynamics. I'm not sure, Kevin. I've had lots of wonderful conversations with Kevin, partly on X, partly in real life. I say real life, I mean YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
My
Mm-hmm.
God, what is happening to me?
I mean, it is
But
real life to some
yeah,
extent.
a little bit more human than arguing on X. But I don't know whether he's using it so much to track down what we call the neural correlates of consciousness. So yeah, so that's what I would throw out to neuroscientists that I don't think is really being done is look at the different models we have and see whether any of them are associated with new causal dynamics. I think it's not being done largely for reasons of fashion. That, I mean, Kevin Mitchell, I think, is quite unpopular in this because we do have more of a reductionist picture that's often just assumed to be obviously true. And this is what Sean Carroll argues very passionately for. I've had wonderful, productive disagreements with Sean. But as Sean agrees, we've never really tested this. You know, his argument really is it will make problems with physics if we go for this. But as I say, there have been identified possible options for how we could fit this in with known physics, but it hasn't really been. It is incredibly hard because these living systems are so complicated. I don't know whether it would help to bring in Laplace's demon. The great 19th century French physicist Laplace imagined this super intelligence. He never called it a demon. I don't know why. At some point people started calling it Laplace's demon. This super intelligence who knows all the fundamental physics, where all the particles and fields are, and it has unlimited reasoning capacities. Could it work? Could Laplace's demon work out everything else? Like, who won the last soccer World Cup? Who's president of America? Could they work out all those facts? Sean would say, yeah, sure, because it's just physics running the show. Kevin Mitchell would say, not so sure. Maybe Laplace's demon would be surprised when it gets at certain levels of biological complexity that things start behaving a little bit differently. I'm kind of inclined to that possibility, although, we just don't know. We have to test it. It's not being tested.
A few comments to what you said earlier about we don't know, like, is it consciousness happening on prefrontal or on the back? So, like, actually, I recently spoke with Andrea Lupi. He's a neuroscientist, and he pointed out on really interesting work where the part of the brain, thalamus, it's, as I understand, it's like a middle, like very deep part of the brain in the middle. The scientists, basically monkeys, they were under anesthesia, and when they stimulated that part of the brain, they immediately woke up. They were able to bring monkeys back to conscious state, just stimulating that thalamus part of the brain. So there is already some progress happening where at least you can control, I would say, the consciousness and bring back at least monkeys from anesthesia. And also, I recently spoke with Mark Solms. I don't know if you ever spoke with him or
Yes.
had interviews
Yeah,
with
very
him.
much. I've interacted with him in correspondence. I would love to have a one-to-one at some point. I haven't met him in person.
In the conversation, he mentioned, I don't remember what the correct name of the condition is, but basically he mentioned example with newborn children whose like the prefrontal cortex is not developed. There's basically some like condition that it's not developed, but like those newborns, they're still like conscious, right? They still like experience pain, and you can guess that they're conscious. So I guess there is already progress happening and like better understanding where at least that awakening happening. Though I don't know if it could be generalized to, to all the understanding of consciousness, or just how, the consciousness in a human brain works. Not necessarily it will work on other species.
I mean, there's definitely lots of interesting work, and it is still a new science in the sense that science of consciousness only kickstarted again in the 1990s. Very good friends with Anil Seth, who's doing very interesting work on predictive processing and so on. So, I mean, you're right, there is lots of interesting work, but there's also so much disagreement. I think that the results you've just mentioned, I think you'll find other scientists who disagree. And I mean, Matthias Michel, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, he has a recent article called "Consciousness Doesn't Do That," I think it's called, or something like that, going through these opposing camps and pointing out, like, somehow they're just kind of making certain assumptions that the other side would disagree with. This is the skill of philosophy, I think, of identifying these underlying assumptions that people have maybe missed. Another article by Tom McClelland at Cambridge on the question of whether consciousness is computational or biological, something highly relevant to AI. He argues for permanent agnosticism on this. He says, like, what test could we ever have to pin that down? Now, I think that's a bit too pessimistic. I'm going to have Tom on our Mind Chat soon, actually, and debate it with him a bit. I'm a bit more hopeful, but it certainly is. We can certainly say there's very little consensus at the moment, and I think we do need some new ideas to try and make a bit of progress.
Do you think it would be possible to come to any consensus, or it's kind of topic as religion? With religion, you can come to like someone is Christian, someone is Muslim. Maybe is it basically consciousness debate? Is it like more religious debate, or it's on the scale, it's like can get closer to like scientific debate?
I'm hopeful, my wife says I'm an optimist. My personal view is that we're not at first base in a sense, although there is some great scientific work going on, but I think we're not at first base in really understanding the problem, how different it is to other scientific problems. And I think once we get to that point, I think that will open up more possibilities, and maybe some consensus will come out of that. I mean, look, to be honest, I think it is partly people not knowing what the hell philosophy is and thinking, we just do the experiments, we get the results. Science is wonderful, but sometimes you can't just do the experiments. You need to question the underlying assumptions. You need to make certain judgment calls. But also, look, it depends what you're trying to do. I think there are two tasks with consciousness. I think of the scientific task as trying to locate consciousness, work out what physical activity goes along with consciousness. And that's already incredibly difficult and already needs a lot of philosophy. But the philosophical task, I think, is, well, how does consciousness fit in with reality more generally? How does what we know about the inside fit in with what we know about the outside in more general terms? And I actually don't think that's an experimental question. I don't think that's a question we can answer with an experiment. It's not really that kind of normal scientific question.
How we potentially then can answer? I mean, stupid question.
Can I give you an analogy? I'm very interested recently in the book I've just submitted to the publishers, my new book called Heresy. With an attempt in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to reduce mathematics to logic. Okay, this might sound like something very different. Why would you want to do that? Because traditionally, mathematicians have been Platonists. Followers of Plato believe that numbers really exist outside of space and time. This is what Plato believed. They're as real as, tables and chairs. They're just outside of space and time. And this causes problems. How the hell do we know about them if they're outside of space and time? Plato had a story that, the soul existed with the numbers outside of space and time before we're born. And so when we do mathematics, we're sort of remembering that former pre-existence before birth. He talked about this in his famous dialogue, Meno dialogue, where he has a slave boy teaching a slave boy mathematics, sort of a bit of liberal kind of egalitarianism there, that this slave boy can do mathematics. Anyway, but like that's a bit of a weird story. If we can kind of get rid of numbers, if we can reduce numbers to logic, then we've done away with that problem.
Logic could be wrong. So basically, we might settle on some wrong logic, even it sounds like logical.
I mean, we're getting down to
justify
brass
pretty
tacks.
much everything. You can justify pretty much everything. Like in any irrational behavior, irrational phenomena, you can find some logic and justify it. That's why if we settle down only, not having experiments, then we won't have consensus.
Maybe we will. And this is what I'm saying with this project. It was making progress to reduce mathematics to modern predicate logic, which is a quite well-developed science invented by Frege, who was trying to explain mathematics in terms of, it failed for many reasons because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem was a spanner in the works. But then since the 1980s, there's been a resurgence of interest in this and shown ways of perhaps getting around this. Now, how do we do this? We can't do an experiment. You can't do an experiment to see whether Peano's arithmetic is reducible to modern predicate logic. You do philosophy. You look at it in great detail. You make arguments. You make judgment calls. You see if it makes sense. And I can see, like, especially if one is very much involved in experimental science, how is that possible? But it is possible. It's what philosophers do. You're right. It's very hard to get consensus. But I think it is possible. I mean, I can give you one example of a philosophical argument that persuaded everyone. And it's again by one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Galileo, right? Before Galileo, people for thousands of years, following Aristotle and others, believed that heavier objects fell faster. Galileo proved with pure reason that is contradictory. It doesn't matter. I talk about this in my book, Galileo's Error. I won't go into it now, maybe, but there's this myth that he dropped a feather and a lead ball from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I think historians think that didn't actually happen, but he didn't need to do that. He proved it doesn't make sense. So this is what we do in philosophy. We try to we get very careful and precise. We try to see if things don't make sense, if they're incoherent, if there's more simplistic options. I think we need to do this in quantum mechanics as well. There's discussions in quantum mechanics with the many worlds theory that Sean Carroll likes. Can it make sense of probability? What is probability? So this is philosophy. How do we do it? I don't know, but we do. It is possible. We're living in a period of history where science has gone so well. People think that's everything. Just do the experiments, but you can't get all the answers that way. We need to make progress also by careful thought, rigorous argumentation. I have hope that we will get consensus. Perhaps we'll get consensus better when we get out of this scientific phase of history where we realize actually you do have to do philosophy. The public comes to understand that a bit more. Maybe we'll get some consensus. I don't know. We can give it a go.
Maybe AI can help us. As I understood from your previous public talks, that you don't think that AI systems conscious, at least currently. But I'm wondering, do you think that they might develop the capability of being conscious? Like, what is your take on when it comes to AI consciousness?
Firstly, I would say these matters are very uncertain because, as we've discussed, consciousness is not publicly observable. What we can do is start in the human case and try and extrapolate from there, and it's already very difficult. But my own view is I don't think consciousness is supernatural or magical. I don't think God is attaching a soul at conception. So I think it's got to be possible to have artificial consciousness. But my own view is that it's not going to look anything like a large language model. I think consciousness is biological rather than computational. So it would look more like an artificial living system. Maybe in the first instance, something like a microbe or something with a very simple conscious experience. Maybe in 5,000 years, something with the cognitive sophistication of a human being. So I think, to my mind, that will be the path to artificial consciousness. not sort of training up these, in my view, non-conscious systems to sort of replicate patterns of the internet, which has gone incredibly well, and it's unbelievable what we've achieved. I don't personally think that's the route to consciousness.
My argument here, like when you mentioned that about, like learning how human brain works and extrapolate, like again, where we're thinking about other creatures, other entities as humans, but AI, artificial intelligence, could be very, very different from human intelligence, and what is native to human brain would be very different from their intelligence, that artificial mind. Maybe we should avoid that anthropomizing and like
Yeah.
extrapolating like our experience to AI, but rather learn how AI can its native way start perceiving reality. I don't know, is it possible? I guess the interpretability teams trying to actually figure it out, but and the same with other species, right? Like with insects or other creatures. Probably, like if we understand human brain, doesn't mean that we understand brain of other species who are not mammals.
I spoke at an AI summit in Stockholm a few years ago, and we had this posh meal the night before, and we went around the table saying, when will we have artificial general intelligence or artificial consciousness? And all the tech leaders were saying, 50 years, 10 years, 100 years. And I was saying, maybe 5,000. Oh, here's the philosopher at the table. But no, both of what you said then were, really good arguments and really important challenges. So look, we're doing philosophy, right? There's the question, like, how do we do this? But this is what we're doing. I made one argument, and then you're saying, well, isn't that anthropomorphizing? And so, yeah, this is how we do it. It's definitely a possibility. It could be these have consciousness that's very different to ours. I certainly agree. I'm inclined to think insects are conscious. I mean, was it a couple of years ago now? There was the New York Declaration of a couple of hundred scientists saying they now take seriously insect consciousness and reptile consciousness. How could we know that? How could we show that? The only tool I think we have at the moment is to start in our own case with the consciousness we know exists in ourselves and try and work out what's going on there and extrapolate. I mean, there's another paper by Eric Schwitzgebel saying this just peters out and we just can't do it anymore. He argues we will never know whether a snail is conscious. It's too distant from the human case. As I said, there's the paper saying, we will just never be able to test whether it's computational or biological. If it's computational, maybe future LLMs will be conscious, maybe if it's biological, not. The tools we have at the moment is just to start from the human case and extrapolate. But, I'm open to other suggestions. And in a sense, I've articulated one, right, about exploring whether there are new causal dynamics that are surprising relative to known chemistry and physics. So suppose we look at a computational system and we look at a sort of computationally equivalent biological system. Oh, and one of them, the biological one, has new causal dynamics that you wouldn't have predicted from known chemistry when you look very carefully, but the computational one doesn't. It's just what you'd expect. I think, okay, that would be a sign that the consciousness is biological rather than computational. That's one possibility.
But if that causal dynamic you also can observe in computational system, then it will convince you that consciousness is not biological.
I framed the hypothetical in terms of the view I favor, but
I know you're biased.
Right. You're completely right. It could. So, I mean, why I have that bias, I suppose, is connected to my more philosophical views that I kind of think consciousness is the stuff of the world, the flesh and blood of the world, rather than something abstract and computational. But that's very, very, I admit that's just a starting point. And ultimately, we want more experimental confirmation from that. But it's hard to know how we do it. I definitely accept what you've said about the computational is a possibility. But I want to know, how do we know that? How do we know that other than extrapolating from the human case? I'm open to any ideas, but I'd want to know how what the case is. It's very hard.
What I find very interesting that you're panpsychic, and like that. As I understand that the philosophy of panpsychism, that the fundamental particles of reality, they're conscious, but then you said that socks are not conscious, and I was thinking about it, and yeah, like let's if we would take an analogy with a family, like each individual of the family, they're conscious, but it's not like we as a family we share the same qualia, right? So it doesn't mean that our family is a conscious being,
Yeah, yeah,
even though
yeah.
like we each of us are conscious. So okay, then I kind of reconciled with the idea that even the particles of socks, they're conscious, but the sock itself is not conscious. It doesn't have like sock experience. But then it's interesting, like where's that threshold when those conscious particles at some point they make that the entire entity start perceiving reality and start actually having experience of being that whole thing. Why we are denying that AI system can't develop that capability at some point.
Your wonderful example there of the family reminds me of an analogy William James came up with, one of my favorite thinkers, 19th century psychologist and philosopher, saying, if we have 10 people and each of them thinks the word of a sentence, you won't have consciousness of the whole sentence associated with the group. And he was raising this pressing certain challenges to panpsychism, actually, that he was attracted to, and then he thought, no, I can't make sense of how conscious particles make a unified conscious system, and then he kind of came back to it. And anyway, yeah, look, I agree it's a possibility. And look, this is the big debate of our time, I think. Is consciousness biological or is it computational? And people with very different philosophies of consciousness can go different ways. I mean, I just had interviewed Anil Seth on my own YouTube channel, Philip Goff Philosophy, quick advert there. We have very different philosophies of consciousness. He's a physicalist. He thinks we can explain consciousness in the terms of physical science. As you say, I'm a panpsychist, but we both think consciousness is more biological. Whereas David Chalmers, very well known, perhaps the most influential philosopher of consciousness, he's more on my side with the philosophy. He's open to panpsychism or even dualism, that consciousness is non-physical, although he wants to make that non-supernatural, non-religious. He calls himself a naturalistic dualist. But he agrees with you more. He's more inclined to think consciousness is computational. And, part of his argument for that, again, he's, how do we do this? Construct these philosophical arguments. He says, well, look, imagine we slowly swapped each neuron in my brain for a sort of silicon duplicate that was functionally indiscernible, that did exactly the same stuff. And we did it very, very slowly, maybe over a long period of time, neuron by neuron, until after 10 years, I had a silicon brain. Well, if those neurons, this is Chalmers' argument, if those neurons behave in exactly the same way, they're silicon duplicates. If those silicon duplicates behave in exactly the same way as the neurons did, then the organism will behave exactly the same. So you could say to me, are you still conscious? Your consciousness okay? And I'd say, oh yeah, sure. As my brain is slowly becoming silicon. And you'd never notice anything different. And so Chalmers concludes, well, we just think you're still conscious when you have a completely silicon brain. So this is his sort of philosophical thought experiment to defend this idea that consciousness is computational rather than biological. I've written some responses to that in my book, modestly titled Why the Purpose of the Universe, if people are interested. But yeah, look, it's the big debate of our time. I have a view. I'm more inclined to the biological view, but that's very tentative.
Panpsychist could have like the view that it's only biological. Isn't it the contradiction there?
So panpsychism is the view that the fundamental building blocks of reality, maybe particles or maybe fields, have very rudimentary forms of consciousness. Some panpsychists, like Luke Roelofs, think that means that absolutely everything is conscious because they're just combinations of the same conscious particles. So rocks and socks. What he says is he doesn't think rocks and socks have unified consciousness. So he thinks they have very fragmented consciousness. He has very interesting discussions about split brain cases in this context. He's also a vegan. He thinks plants are conscious, but they don't feel pain, they don't suffer. Very interesting work there. So some panpsychists think, yeah, literally everything is conscious. I'd say more panpsychists think, no, it's only in certain circumstances that those conscious particles, let's say, come together to make a unified conscious system. But yeah, this is the $1,000,000 question. When does that happen? Is it something to do with computation?
I would
Is
say
it
it's a
something to
trillion.
do with
At this point, it's $1 trillion
Yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah. So why do you think it's computational?
My bias is that if system is complex enough and perceives so many things in reality, and like once we have now the argument is okay, we scrape data from the internet, but like actually we went beyond the internet. Now those systems interacting with billions of people, they're actually like all the data is trained like based on conversations with people and like absolute like new input, right? And like once those systems will be deployed in the real world and they will start perceiving reality, then that complexity might, like as an emergent behavior, as an emergent, like I don't know, like feature, that perception of reality and some subjective experience of reality might occur. We can't deny it, because if the system is trained to perceive reality, then we can't deny that it won't be able to develop that subjective experience of reality if it's specifically sort of like trained to do that. So that's why I'm sort of like biased that it might occur. It's not something that researchers will train AI to be conscious, but there are lots of emergent behavior that they already see in AI, in the current AI systems, and we can't deny that subjective experience as emergent behavior might occur in computational systems.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a possibility. Everything here is so uncertain. We need to have humility, and I think, in the pretty near future, this is going to become a very concrete question, because if anyone saw the Chinese New Year robotics display, the
Yeah,
incredible
yeah.
robots. I mean, I think what do you think? I don't know, decades maybe we're going to have in houses, maybe houses of wealthier people in the first instance, robots that behave just like us and have large language models that you can chat to them. People are going to be falling in love with their robots. People are going to be demanding the right to marry their robots. We're going to want to know, are these things conscious? So it is an urgent question, and it's a very difficult question. All I would say for certain is that because of the unique nature of consciousness, we need the philosophy as well as the science. Not a replacement for the science, but we need both. We need both together.
What would convince you, or like not convince, but made you think that maybe that machine is conscious? Is it something like in the behavior of that machine, or what would like think that maybe there is something?
I think maybe, well, you answered the question. One answer to that, if there were novel causal dynamics that you would not have predicted, that was, I mean, it gets very difficult, isn't it? Because I've chatted to people from OpenAI, that we design these systems but then they're so complicated, we really don't know how they're doing what they're doing. But I suppose there is an assumption, and I had this confirmed talking to people, designed rather large language models, that we believe we kind of understand the basic dynamics, even if it's so complicated we don't really know what it's doing in a particular case. But we saw that they started doing something different that was like contrary to what you'd expect from the physics. That starts to sound magical, but actually, I think that it's a scientific hypothesis that's gone out of favor a bit, but it's something that can be precisely articulated. I mean, I remember there was a sci-fi show, Westworld,
Yeah, it
a
was
while
like,
back. You remember that, with these kind
yeah,
of androids,
2018. Yeah.
and that was how you knew they were conscious. That they sort of went a bit AWOL. They went against their programming, and I mean, it's so difficult to tell now because these large language models, they're not just sort of programmed to do such and such. But that, I mean, that would convince me, if it was, but I don't know how we'd establish this experimentally. If they started behaving in ways that you would not expect from the underlying known physics, that would convince me. But look, I mean, if you did have a large language model in a robot that behaves like us, it would be very difficult not to believe it's conscious, wouldn't it?
Like people say, like, oh, like a zombie, and but if it behaves like a human and interacts with you, it's about then human perceptions, not even about whether that machine is conscious, but like how I perceive it, and that also changes the whole social dynamic, right? And then we're
Yeah.
talking about moral considerations towards AI systems, and our relationships with them on a physical level. Not now it's like relations like on intellectual level, right? Like we're talking with the chatbots, but then once physical AI is like on scale, on production level, scaled production level, and deployed, then we're interacting with them every day.
It's scary, it's important, it's challenging. Robot rights, what kind of rights are we going to want to give them? A philosopher friend of mine, oh my god, who I'm blanking on his name now, even though he's a good friend of mine, who has very different philosophical opinions to me. He thinks, even if they're not conscious, if they're behaving just like us, we should give them rights. And it's maybe like a kind of racism to say, oh, just because they don't have consciousness, because consciousness is like maybe our thing, the sort of the human or the biological thing. Maybe there's something computational that's just as important, that's not consciousness in our sense, but is just as important. I don't buy that myself, but it's a very interesting argument.